on today's podcast, we have a very special guest, Chris Dixon, general partner at Andreessen Horowitz, founder and managing partner at A16Z Crypto, and author of Read, Write, Own, Building the Next Era of the Internet. We're such big fans of the book and so honored to have you, Chris. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We're super excited. I read your book over the weekend, and I got to tell you, I was approaching it like, I got to do my homework. Chris is coming on the pod, and I loved it. I feel so inspired to do my work today. And awesome. Yeah, it's just really put a lot of language to the things that I care about and why we do Boys Club. So just want to start by saying people should read it. It's really good.
Well, thank you. That's great. That's awesome to hear. Thank you.
So you're on the tail end of this book tour. You've done all of the podcasts, from friendly sort of conversations at like a Bankless of the world to not so friendly conversations doing God's work with the Hard Fork dudes and Pivot and other podcasts like that. You're a New York Times bestseller. There has been a Barbie level marketing campaign for this book. And it's been fun to see. So here at Boys Club, we do this thing called the feelings check-in. And so we're going to force you into this. Okay. So to start, how are you feeling after a really big month for you in this book?
Thank you. No, I'm good. So we started in New York and had a party, and I did a bunch of podcasts, as you said. And then we went to London, which was great. And then there was this London flu going around. So outside of that, I was sort of knocked out for a week in bed. But and then we had to reschedule we were going to do a Bay Area leg of the tour, which we were going to reschedule. But no, but great overall. I think what you just said is awesome. I've really tried hard to write the book for readers. There's a lot of business books that I think are kind of more written for the author maybe, or for some other mission, and I really wanted it to be for the reader, and sort of made every decision based on that, and spent a lot of time, which I hope came through, trying to really simplify the concepts, not use jargon. The way I think about it, it was all these years of thinking about this problem. How can I share that with people in a way that they really understand it? And it's not just sort of I think it's particularly around blockchain books, probably all tech books, but blockchain books, there's a lot of jargon, and people use words like decentralization, or trust, or other kinds of words that are loaded, and what does it really mean? And so I really wanted to break it down, and that's been great. I think that, so I sort of, my mental model for marketing the book is that the step one has to be that the crypto folks both like it a lot, and then also, but see it as the book that they kind of recommend to their friends.
Yeah.
And then, and then if it can do that, I feel like then it can kind of grow from there. And I feel like that's going really, really well. The reviews, just on Amazon and just on Farcaster and Twitter, and just people's feedback has been great. So it's been awesome. I was worried, because it's a very abstract topic. It's really a book about networks. And so it was just really hard to make that not overly abstract, I guess. And so that I think that was my number one concern, with people just be it's just too, I don't know, abstract, or just hard to understand, or I didn't get that through. And I feel very good about that now, just based on the reactions. It was, a lot of it, as was through examples, and just trying to make it concrete and tell stories, and sort of mix in the kind of spinach with the fun stuff. You know what I mean? Sort of there are parts where it's just sort of explaining, but I tried to kind of sandwich that with a lot of stories and concrete stuff. So I think it's early. It's also a book. My publisher said it takes a few months to start seeing kind of the word of mouth. I'd never written a book before. I never, it's not like a website where you just sort of you put up the website. I'm used
Refreshing.
To websites. Yeah, and it's and if you go viral the next day or something, with a book, people have to read it and talk about it, and it takes time to sort of, fully kind of propagate. So we'll see how that goes over the next few months.
Well, congratulations. So far, I think it's been a huge success. I think one of the ways that it's been meaningful for me is that we've been here for the past couple of years, building in a time when it's been really hard. And there's definitely been moments where my conviction in this industry, this technology, this community has been questioned, where I'm is this the right path for us? Are we putting our life force into the right places? And there's been moments that I've been really challenged by that. And I think reading your book really reminded me of this idea of a new era of the internet, one that's more equitable, one that's more creative, one that's more open. And I think that has really underlined, like, yeah, okay, that is why I'm here personally. And it was really great to be reminded of that. And I'd love for any listeners who are maybe new to this worldview, if you could give us kind of the 2-minute elevator pitch on your thesis so that there's a grounding for them in this conversation.
Yeah, sure. So it's a big topic. There's a lot of different ways to explain it. But basically the thesis is that the internet has gone through kind of at least 2 phases, and I think entering a 3rd phase. And so, and I walk through this in the book, but in the first era of the internet, which I sort of think of the modern internet, the sort of 1990 to 2005 or so, the internet was dominated by open protocols like email and the web. And what that meant was the way those networks were architected, essentially the money and the control flowed out to the participants of the network, the people that, if you make a website, you own and control that website. And, if you're an artist, you know that whatever you build a relationship with your audience, you have a direct relationship with your audience. It's not mediated by Facebook or some algorithm that could change the rankings or, change the economics. If you're an entrepreneur, you know, as of course Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and all the entrepreneurs who famously build websites in that era, you knew that what you built you owned, and that if there were economic value created, that you owned that, and you had a direct relationship with your audience. And so I think of that as just having a bunch of very positive, both kind of economic and societal consequences, that network design. And for those who were around for that era, it was very inspiring. There were, I think, been a little bit lost in time, but there was this huge wave of like books and magazines and just like kind of cultural movement around this idea that the internet would kind of, honestly, sort of people thought it would restructure society, economics, culture. And kind of my argument is that then in the next era, sort of the 2000s, after the dot-com crash and the kind of rebuilding, which I was an entrepreneur during that era, so I had a very direct experience with it, that kind of we made that there were good things and bad things that happened. On the good side, a new wave of internet services were developed, things like social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, which were very powerful, which had a lot of benefits. So that, before something like Twitter or Facebook, you would have to go to publish online as an average person. You'd have to go spin up a blog and RSS and all these sort of technical things, and it would be expensive. And they subsidized that and made it easy. And that led us to the current moment, right, where we have 5 billion people who are online and publishing. And I think that had positive effects in the sense that it sort of democratized publishing and the internet. But the trade that was made in the process of that was that we essentially handed over power to a set of 5 to 10 internet services that were architected in a very different way than the networks of the 90s. They're architected in a way, I call them corporate networks, where all of the kind of money and control goes to the center of the network instead of the edges of the network, to the corporate owners. And that trade, I think, sort of seemed okay in the 2000s and maybe even the early 2010s, because those services, for a bunch of cultural and other reasons, were kind of still committed to some of the ideals of the early internet and were open and built a level playing field. But then that changed. In the book, I kind of walk through it, but I think around 2012, 13, really sharply started to change. And, fast forward today, you can't even put links on Twitter, because all of these services are not only fighting for market share, but now fighting to keep you on the websites. And they have these opaque algorithms, and you hear stories of creators who build audiences, and then mysteriously the next day that audience disappears or is diminished because the algorithm changes. And I have a chapter in the book about this, the so-called take rates, which is the percentage of the money flowing through the network that goes to the network operators, is sort of unprecedented in economic history, that like 100% of the money flowing through networks like Facebook and Twitter go to the network operators and not to the users. And so just all of these kinds of promises in the 90s in that sense were lost. And then the kind of the next section of the book, the core argument is that blockchains provide a third way to build networks. So you had these sort of 2 prior ways. You had these protocol networks that had all these societal benefits, and then you had these corporate networks that built advanced functionality, but we traded the societal benefits. And kind of the core argument of the book is that blockchains allow you to create new networks that are kind of the best of both worlds, that let you have a lot of the societal benefits of protocol networks, but also build advanced functionality that we've come to expect from the modern internet. And then I go through, I think in a lot of detail, I hope, because I'm really trying to not be hand wavy and just really go through the economics, I go through the kind of how they're controlled, I go through how tokens work. With tokens, think of tokens as if you want communities to own something, you need a way for them, a mechanism for them to own something, and tokens are that mechanism, right? And so in a well-designed blockchain network, the community owns that network through tokens and has control and economic rights. There's a chapter on network governance, which is sort of how do you make decisions around these networks and control. And then at the last section, I try to dive deeply into 7 application areas. So this is sort of, people often say, like, what problems do blockchains solve? This is too abstract. So I try to go very specifically into 7 areas: video games, social networks, financial services, some stuff around AI, and really get specific. That's not meant to be exhaustive because it's a huge topic, but I thought really trying to kind of give it more specific flavor. So yeah, and like some of the stuff I discuss is the present, some of it is history, obviously, and then some is the present, the technology like blockchains and tokens and things. And then some of it is about the future. So obviously, I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not expecting people to come away saying this is 100% likely to happen, because obviously there's uncertainty there. But the main thing I wanted to get through was that there's real societal benefits to the technology because of what you were describing, Deana, the last few years, especially with FTX and all these other kind of scandals. I think a lot of people have come away thinking that it's either sort of scams or just a way to make money or number go up, which exists. But my kind of argument is that every technology is multifaceted. It has good and bad aspects. And that when you think about things like policy, like regulation, the sensible way to do it is to kind of look at the technology expansively across both the good and bad use cases and sort of try to design the policy to maximize the good and minimize the bad. So I feel like in a lot of the discussions, the sort of good side had been lost and needed to be shared and discussed. But yeah, like to your point, I think anyone in the space, I would be surprised if after the stuff that happened 2 years ago, the kind of series of events, I would actually say even before the kind of crash, just some of the kind of, I think a lot of the kind of upturn in the market I forgot what it was, 2021 or something, at some point for me transitioned from cool and interesting to kind of silly. Mm-hmm. And then of course all the things that followed. I think anyone who cares about the internet would have questions at that point. At least for me, like the book was partly a process of self-examination and thinking about those questions myself. And I just look at things like AI, and I think the former engineer in me thinks AI is amazing. I mean, it is amazing, and it's very cool what the people are building, but I don't see, short of some counterbalancing force, I really just cannot see a scenario where AI doesn't just lead to more consolidation. Yeah. And you just end up with this internet that's like basically three services or something, or 5 services. And the AI just sort of, you just go to your AI in the morning and it does everything. And there's positive things about that. But I think generally, if we don't think through the kind of economic implications and all of the second order consequences and all the things I discuss in the book, I don't think that's going to be the right outcome. A very simple question is, do you want an internet where there's an incentive to be creative, for humans to be creative, and for humans to, put their creativity on the internet for free, the way that they are incentivized today? Because that's not the incentive we're creating right now with AI. If you're an artist, why would you put your art up for free? It's going to get ingested into a training algorithm and then used, and then you're going to be unnecessary, right? I don't think we've thought through these incentive systems, and this is exactly what blockchains are good at. So like, I came out through that period. Like you, I think anyone sensible would have questions, but I came out of it after thinking about it a lot, thinking it's in some sense more urgent than ever that we have counterbalancing technologies as things like AI grow in importance.
You touched on this a bit, but while I have you here, ask you some pain points that we've experienced. For context, I got into crypto about 2.5 years ago. Deana, for many years of our friendship and working partnership, had tried to get me into crypto, and I was just like, no, thank you. And really because I only saw the casino side of it. I just saw it as this financial mechanism. And then there was a real aha moment for me around it as an enabling technology, all of the things you talk about on your book, a whole new consumer internet being able to be created and reaching the edges of the network. And really the main switch for me was thinking about collective building and sort of shared ownership, and how people could contribute to something. There would be an economic upside for them in form of ownership that was meaningful and that looked very different than the internet that I grew up on and how I used it. And so that got me into the space and really excited about building it. And I would say 2.5 years ago, that vision of the future seemed much more possible than almost today, where because of the regulatory environment in the US, it's really hard to imagine my initial thinking of what collective ownership and what sort of building in a collective looks like. And so in sort of the true sense of the word of ownership, which is so much of the heart of your book. So I'd love for you to just talk about how we overcome that, what your perspective is on that, and what we do as like builders and creators in this space in a time where there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the policy situation is we have this weird situation where under the current approach that sort of the SEC and others are taking, if you create a meme coin like Dogecoin, with absolutely no purpose and just release it on the internet, that's perfectly legal. People can speculate on it. And the trouble starts when you start to work on improving the network behind the token. And because then there's all these questions as to some point, like, is there asymmetric information? Is it a security? And so we've actually have a situation where it's sort of the opposite incentives, I think, than what we want societally, right? Where you can just, like meme coins are perfectly legal. You go to Robinhood and like they will let you trade Dogecoin, they won't let you trade Solana. That's for legal reasons, right? So it's like inverted of what it should be. So to your point, that's a real challenge. The way I look at it is sort of in a long-term way. So we sort of had this prehistory of kind of Bitcoin and all these things happening prior to 2021. But I think for a lot of mainstream people, like crypto didn't kind of exist for real until that period. And then you had these bad incidents and you had this reaction to it. And, the reaction in some sense is sensible given how a lot of bad stuff, you can imagine there's going to be some reaction. But I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I feel like over time we're going to come to like a balanced, proper view of this. And I'll say I spent a lot of time in DC last year, and I would say that my experience was positive in that sense. And this is bipartisan, by the way. Like all of our efforts are bipartisan. And in fact, probably spent more time on the Democratic side. And there's a wing of the Democratic Party that obviously hates crypto, but there's a lot of people, I think, who are very kind of reasonable and want to discuss things and have, read books and have staff that read books. And like another thing I'll say is in tech, it really just takes one great product to transform things. I mean, I think we saw that with ChatGPT, in history, with the iPhone, things like this. Like, there's a lot of revisionism around. Like, I remember the iPhone. Like, their smartphones have been around for 15 years. I had smartphones for years. I had friends doing smartphone startups, 10 years before the iPhone. And it was sort of this thing where, you'd almost roll your eyes when someone was doing a smartphone thing because it was always this thing, but it was like, I don't know what the numbers were, but like 10 million people had them. So like they were a thing and you'd walk around and see them, but it was never kind of broke out, right? And meanwhile, feature phones were, I don't know what, hundreds of millions. And sort of this question of loomed over it of like, when will it actually break out and how will people justify the expense? Because it was just, they would be dramatically more expensive. AI, I started an AI company in 2008. Like it literally is an 80-year history. If you go to Wikipedia, you'll see there's a 1980s AI bubble, literally a financial bubble in the 80s around expert systems. I mean, they actually talk in AI. They use the same language as crypto of summers and winters. And it just took really, I think, one breakout product. So I think on the positive, so I hear you. I think, look, there's a lot of challenges, but I also think, I don't know, my experience is that it seems like most policymakers are sensible. They want the best societal outcome. I think we make the case through like lots of things, through, obviously things like books and messaging and that kind of stuff, but also I think really importantly products.
Yeah.
I think about it like that way. Like we have, I would say there's at least 20 very high quality companies that we're involved with that have products coming out in the next 12 months. And I think any one of them obviously on its own is a long shot, but collectively, like could one of those be a ChatGPT kind of moment? I think yes. And that can just change it overnight. Like I hear these debates, should we rebrand things NFTs? And I'm just like, look, MP3s, JPEGs, like there's been so many bad names like in the history of tech. I mean, ChatGPT, is that a great name? Like it just kind of doesn't matter if you have a great product, in my view.
Yeah.
And just one great product. I go to DC, like just having something that can just demonstrate all of the benefits of this technology in one product would be such a transformational thing for those discussions. So I don't know. I mean, yeah, like it's not, I do think in some sense we took a step back, as you said, from 2.5 years ago, certainly on the messaging side. I think that the other flip side is the technology. I won't go too much into this, but I do think the core technology is very important. And like, well, look, one question is why did AI happen when it happened? I think a lot of it is, I mean, no one's written a definitive history of it yet, but it's kind of funny, right? It's because the GPUs got so much better.
Yeah.
So you could run these bigger models. Why did GPUs get better? Because of video games. Like, it's kind of this, like, so it turns out video games created our AGI overlord indirectly or something, right? But the point I'm making, the GPUs, it's very important because the core underlying infrastructure really does matter. I mean, like, I think as much as Steve Jobs is a genius, I think you could argue that, I would argue that had Steve Jobs not existed, somebody would have created something like a killer smartphone in that era, maybe 2 years later or something. Because you just fundamentally, if you just looked at the kind of the underlying trends, like semiconductors were getting better, screens were getting better, batteries were getting better. And I think a similar thing you can kind of do with blockchains, where it's like the performance and the security and all the underlying trends are getting significantly better, like compared to 2.5 years ago. So that's another kind of positive sign. So, the timing is always hard to predict, but I do think that the trends are headed in the right direction.
Until we get that breakthrough product, as you're talking about, maybe it will happen in the next 12 months with one of your projects, but I hope
from Chris's lips to God's ears.
I hope so. In the meantime, we are in an environment, I think, with the mainstream media narrative around crypto, Web3, blockchains, whatever you want to call it, I'd say is skeptical at best and cynical at worst. And I think you talk about this in your book about how the mainstream media is cherry picking the worst of an emergent technology. I do think the distinction around casino and computer really breaks that. And I think that that's a really useful distinction and can give people language for how these things are different. What do you think? I mean, I think you'll probably say a breakthrough product, but like, how can we get this narrative out into the world? And asking, like, really personally, we're going to South by Southwest in a few weeks and we're doing a consumer crypto summit. And I'd say South by Southwest, that environment is crypto unfriendly. And it's really hard to be going into that type of environment and trying to create a conversation around like a positive, optimistic, well-intentioned new internet that has things like blockchain at the core of it. So it's hard. And we're asking seriously, like what do you think is needed to help shift that narrative?
Yeah, I think you would both probably have more insight into this than me, but I think unfortunately somehow crypto got inserted into the kind of culture war. It's interesting. I was just in the UK and we were speaking to some policymakers, and it's not the case there. Like there's obviously proponents and skeptics, but it's not kind of this charged political issue, the way that it is here. And I think it's, I'm not a political expert, but I think it has something to do with the origins of Bitcoin being kind of coded as right-wing, libertarian, the kind of articles around the kind of tech bros and the money, and somehow it just got associated with kind of right-wing something or other, which it's obviously not the case. I mean, blockchain is a software construct, like the idea that it's got a political orientation. And if anything, I think you can argue a lot of the things one does with a blockchain might code left more than right, I think.
Yeah.
So, and I also say, like, it's unfortunate this happened because we want this to be an inclusive movement. We want people from different political directions to contribute to it. And now you have this, there's some risk of kind of a self-perpetuating thing where if everybody says it's this kind of libertarian right-wing thing, then that sort of just feeds into the Bitcoiners and the ones who, like it attracts more of those people and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't know how to counter that. I mean, except to just get the truth out and have people see it, and but that's an unfortunate overlay, right? I think the world, I would love your thoughts on this because I haven't figured this out, but I also think the world is different now around tech, and the tech world hasn't fully figured this out, to be honest. So I think an interesting question is crypto just the kind of canary in the coal mine? Or in other words, is this the new, like, look what's happening with AI right now, like generative AI. I just saw this Twitter thread, and it was like a list of like 10 anti-generative AI viral Twitter threads, right, that had like 100,000 likes. I think you could argue that this is just the new world, that like everything is political, and that tech existed in this kind of sandbox for 40 years. It's just sort of like those nerds over there, ignore them, right? But like it never had these kind of politically charged overtones. And I think maybe that's changed, and crypto is just the first to experience it. Maybe, we'll see. I mean, AI is still early. Like, will like generative AI get coded? I think in some ways AI could be more politically charged because it's going to take jobs, middle class jobs. And also, I don't know, like it just feels like it could just be the very beginning of that. like social media became like this in a lot of ways, right? I mean, it became, I think, post 2016 election became very politically charged. So I think one question, just to your question, is like, how do we overcome that? And I feel a little bit like out of my depth there because I'm not, I don't know how to overcome political issues or political animosity. Obviously, the product point is important, like getting good products out there. I think this is why I wanted to write the book so badly, is just having, like, I've never seen a mainstream explanation of, well, just to give you a simple example, the press will often just accept the fact that all tokens are meme coins, essentially, that there's no underlying economic model, which is simply false. I mean, Ethereum has an economic model. You pay to use Ethereum. People paid about $2 billion in the last 12 months to use the Ethereum network. That money then goes into this, kind of little microeconomy, including as a way to pay the token holders. Like, you can say maybe you think it's dumb or whatever, but it has an economic model, right? And it's just a simple fact. It takes 5 minutes to evaluate that. Yet I've never seen that in the discussion, in the kind of mainstream discussion of this. Like, it's always just sort of like, it's pet rocks, the money comes out of thin air. So I do think, I'm being naively optimistic, but I do think, like, just sharing the actual facts, so much of the public impression is shaped by just the incorrect set of facts, that perhaps that can help somewhat. You both would probably have more expertise on this topic.
Yeah, I think for us, it's been interesting for you to put it in the context of sort of a political conversation. And our experience has definitely been that there's been a certain type of person that's been attracted to Boys Club, primarily young women who are very disillusioned with the world and very disillusioned with the existing institutions that exist, whether it be political or religious or their, workplaces, whatever it is. And they have been actually drawn to crypto as this sort of subversive environment that allows for sort of this, like, blow it up and start over mentality. And I think there's like touches of that in the EAC movement, and people sort of having a deep belief in ideology and connection to tech in a way that at least non-technical, non-engineers have not had, I think, previously. And it's an interesting thing to witness and be a part of. And I think there's some really positive things about it, where people feel passionate about their work and connected to an industry in a different type of way than just a job. But I also think there are these downstream consequences of when something does look like an ideology and a movement, there is a reaction to that that's really visceral. And we've seen that as well, I think. One question around this idea of the casino versus the computer philosophy, and something that was really helpful in reading your book was really talking about how the tokenomics and the design around how you incentivize people through tokens is central to the whole network effect working, and how, this is all this, like, beautiful picture of how it all comes together. And I totally see that, and I'm excited about that future. But a thing that I witness in doing this work and just kept coming back to is it is all sort of tied back to the token. And how do you build outside of this casino mindset, and how do you attract not mercenaries when, like, number go up is baked into the network and baked into the culture around it and crucial to it all working? How do you avoid that lens being so important to the work and to building the tooling and application layer?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And by the way, in my fantasy world, that would be the question we'd be discussing, as opposed to some of the others. Like, this is the honestly, this is a question I think about, like, on the weekends. Is, like, I call it kind of financial dampening in my head. I haven't said it public, like, I haven't worked out what it should be called, if we talk about it publicly. But the idea just being that in some ways tokens are too powerful as a mechanism, that there's sort of this nuclear force or something that, like, if you don't think very carefully about it, can just completely overwhelm these services and just, as you said, become just all about the money. This is where I've come to the policy side of things. Like, I think people might view it as, like, we're doing policy defensively. I actually, if you look at our track record, we've been calling for policy changes, like, long before 2021, and for this reason. So just to give you an example, like, I think the single biggest thing you can do is time horizons. So meaning, like, long lockups. So in my ideal world, no regular user would ever pay for tokens. They would get them airdropped. That's pretty much the norm now, right? So you earn tokens for doing work. So you are an early contributor to a video network and you're uploading video and you're earning some portion of the network or something, right? Early driver for Uber should have earned some of Uber. And then there's some multi-year kind of lockup where you just can't have trading or you've significantly reduced the trading. And you just think about like how tech startups work. People get, they get paid cash, typically market salaries, and then they get some equity on top. But the equity's locked up for a long time. And this is how all Silicon Valley works. Is like it's all kind of profit based, but it's long-term profit based, right?
Yeah.
And what long-term forces you to do is, I have this graph, the kind of Gartner hype cycle graph in the book, where it's sort of like every technology tends to get kind of hyped up and then drop and then has to rebuild. And the way I think about it is, if you have long lockups, you're forced to build actual value,
Right.
because you can't sort of go through a hype cycle. So I just think time horizons, I mean, look, our whole business, I'm not claiming ventures, we're not like better people than other asset classes or something, but the fact that it's 10 years, it kind of forces you to be, because our funds are 10 years. Our returns are like, the average return is probably, 10 years before we see a dollar. It's in that ballpark. It just forces you to have a different mindset. Like you have to build something. Like you have to build a really important thing that hundreds of millions of people use, right? But like we can't impose that. Like when we do investments, we'll say like our default is always a year cliff lockup, like 4-year lockup essentially, but with a 1-year cliff. But if we try to say, hey, there should be a longer one and there should be more restrictive, like at some point entrepreneurs won't work with us. So it really needs to be kind of the quote refs who, the policymakers who impose that. A lot of the proposals that we're supportive of also have things like the project has to do a year of security audits. They have to have disclosures. Like you can do things to mitigate, like a lot of the behavior that you're probably thinking about is behavior that can be mitigated through smart policy, right? We're still in a relatively early phase of crypto, and it's maybe just culturally also dominated more by the number go up people. But I would hope that as it grows, that we'd bring in more people like both of you, I think, who are more interested in the kind of product side of it versus the financial side of it. And so I also think hopefully over time there's sort of a cultural shift. I mean, open source software is, I think of as an analog in some ways. It began very politically in the 80s, and it was a sort of a left-wing anti-capitalism movement, and then morphed into a very pragmatic kind of technology movement. And that made a lot of people overlook it in the 90s because it was still seen as this kind of radical thing. And so, I think potentially that kind of cultural change can happen as, in some ways, it has to happen as you grow, right? Because you just get more normal mainstream people. And
Yeah, totally. I think this is like even a tiny microcosm example, but at Boys Club, there's been a few moments since we started where we were like, well, should we create a token? And ultimately, it came down to two things. One, we were like, neither one of us wanted to go to jail. We were like, just not prepared to do any prison time. And then the second thing was, we've seen other examples where you do launch a token and it creates a hyper financialized environment around something that isn't ready to be financialized. And I think that creates weird outcomes, especially for like media and communities where it starts to be speculative and mercenaries, and like people come in like fruit flies for some sort of airdrop and don't believe in the product or the mission or whatever it is. And so I think that, that's been like a thing that we've come back to a couple different times. But I do think a token lockup could help in that. But I wonder also, like, if this is sort of the mechanism for all of this working, the blockchain working, like how you strike that balance.
so, for example, like Nouns DAO is maybe an example where, you have a community that's less financialized. There is that some financial elements. And I think it's partly because, it's an NFTs. It's not, I think the fungible tokens create more of a financialization. Partly it's just the kind of culture and the people you kind of get involved. Another example is, so we have a portfolio company called Blackbird, which is a restaurant, if you know them, but it's a really talented entrepreneur, Ben Leventhal, who was a founder of Resi before, popular restaurant.
He's a friend of the pod.
Okay.
He's he's great.
But like he's doing some really interesting stuff, where it's, you sort of get loyalty points with restaurants and they're delivered as NFTs, but at the beginning they're non-transferable and they're, kind of restricted in some of the functionality. It's early and we'll see how it evolves, but that's just like one of a number of examples now where I think people are taking kind of more nuanced views of this and really trying to put the emphasis on ownership and not speculation. And so, one way to think about it is there's sort of different, like, what does ownership mean? There's sort of different verbs that it implies, right? Like one is trading. That's, of course, what people have focused on. But the other is switching, as an example, which means like, that's like sort of the Farcaster use case where you can use a social network, but because you own your name, you can switch. You can switch clients, you can switch software. It shifts the power to the user, right? And so I think the product question becomes, how do you use, like, I think this is what Blackbird and Farcaster and some other of the newer products are exploring, is how do you kind of explore ownership in the other verbs around ownership, like switching, like a sense of real connection with like in the case of the restaurant, like you're trying to create an authentic connection as opposed to the trading aspects, right?
I think just to double down on that, I think that that's a really great point, because I think also while we were reading your book, another thing that came up for us was like, do people care about, do they understand this idea of digital ownership? This is new. We've been trained as consumers over the past 10 years to be buying subscriptions to things. And that training runs really deep, so that now if you're just off the street gal and there's some product that's purporting some degree of ownership, digital ownership, I think that's really abstract for folks. And that kind of feels like a prerequisite for any of these networks to work.
I think, so I think you're right that, like, I think people that say like people don't care about ownership per se, that's correct. But like, for example, they do care about economics. And so in a Web 2 style social network where everyone's kind of locked in, right? What that means is that if you're a creator on those networks, you're completely subordinate to the network. They decide how much money you get, right? And people that have big TikTok followings, for example, they're doing all of these kind of what I would consider gymnastics to make money, like sponsorships and selling physical products, which is just, I think it's absurd. They should just be making money through the network, right? The way that if you have an email subscriber list, you would just put up ads and subscriptions and do whatever and make money off your list. Like, you don't need to go, you don't see people with 1 million email subscribers trying to go do these kind of side deals. They can just go direct. And so if, for example, we have, which I hope in the next couple of years, growing decentralized social networks, the fact that you can build a direct relationship with your audience and have 100% of the economics and control, like, that will be meaningful to people, right? Mm-hmm. That'll take time, and you have to build these things out. Like software developers. So for those who are around, like 2008 through 11, like the way people are talking about AI now, they were talking about building, the hot thing in Silicon Valley was building services on top of Facebook and Twitter. And then that kind of got shut down by those networks because they decided that wasn't in their interest. I think that there's all of this latent energy among the software developer community to build on top of internet services. And that if we start to provide them with new platforms where they can build their own clients and analytic services and monetization system, whatever, it's just like it becomes a platform the way that the web is a platform or email is a platform. I think that will get people really fired up. So to your point, like, I don't think people are going to like say I'm switching because of digital ownership. They're going to switch because of there's better software, there's better economics, right? Like, there's a tangible benefit, but that's a consequence of the ownership, right? But that does make it trickier for us to sort of explain this and market it. And again, I keep going back to the product thing. I don't want to be a broken record, but like ultimately it comes down to, like, I can only say this so many times. Like, someone needs to, we need to have the products out there.
Yeah.
That really make show, don't tell, right? But like the economic point, like, so I just keep coming back to the economic point. Like, when I talk about network control, like Twitter having control, like, I think the shadow banning and the kind of political things are overplayed in a lot of ways. I mean, it matters, obviously, if you're banned, you don't like it, but the real consequence of these networks and the way they're architected is economic. Social networks make $150 billion last year in revenue. And that money, there's just no question, had RSS beat out Facebook and Twitter as sort of this underlying substrate for social networking, that $150 billion would have gone to the edge of the network. Like, that is a hugely consequential swing, and you could say it's depressing, but it's also an opportunity, right? Which is, in a lot of ways, those companies are vulnerable. They're taking $150 billion that they don't really earning, and that it's relatively easy to build alternatives that have the same functionality. And the only thing keeping them there is sort of inertia and network effects. And maybe that's strong enough to defend them. But I think, just from a capitalist kind of venture capital point of view, that's a really kind of juicy soft target to go after because they just sort of just taking all this money that they aren't really earning. To your point, I think people are going to care about the money, the control, the quality of the software more than direct ownership. But hopefully in that process, they realize that ownership is the thing that is enabling all of it.
Okay, so just track with me here because there's a few pieces to this question. It runs from what you were just saying into Tina's question. So one of the points you make around and a main theme of these networks is that how they differ from corporate networks is that you're making promises in the foundation of them. And that in the case of, let's say, decentralized social, there's promises that are made and the user is incentivized to switch maybe because of those promises long term. And what I'm struck by is how much early products and early building, you don't know what you're doing till you're doing it. And this is emergent space, this is emergent technology. How do you make those hard promises and fixed rules of a network when you don't know what you're doing, basically, and you don't know how people are going to use it? And then in the same vein, there's the promise of, let's use the OpenSea Blur example, where they had this downward pressure, and because the switching costs are low in NFT marketplaces, everybody moved to Blur. And that was great because the take rates got smaller for people, and that was a positive outcome in many ways. But who lost in that was creators and royalties, and because that wasn't built into the rules of the network to begin with. So would love your insight into those problem areas of network building.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, the question of, okay, so like one of the benefits of a blockchain, right, is, as you mentioned, is that you can write code that kind of commits to how it will behave long term, but it's hard up front to know what that will be. That's also just one of the things that hopefully time solves. Like now, just to give you a simple example, we have a bunch of blockchain-based games that are sort of early stage that we've invested in the last year or two. And they're just a lot more sophisticated than the ones 3 or 4 years ago because they got to see the lessons from from that era, right? So some of it just takes time. Like you have to see kind of mistakes made, essentially. And then part of it is in the design, like in the governance systems of these networks. Some of them, I think, like I usually recommend to the extent possible to leave some flexibility in the beginning. And you'll see this, like a lot of these networks, people will complain about it, but they have they effectively have multi-sig for some of the founders in the beginning who can essentially override those commitments. The logic being just, to your point, like it's hard in the beginning to know. And obviously at some point you need to hand over control to the community, but maybe you delay that somewhat, which seems like a reasonable compromise. And by the way, not to be a broken record, but like in the smart policy approaches, you actually have frameworks for that. So, okay, so at this stage is still controlled by the team. And that means there's more financial guardrails around it. You'd have a whole kind of staged framework for that. So creator royalties, I think, are its own little topic. And I think you could argue that's separate. Those are sort of two things that went on with Blur and OpenSea. One is the fact that you have low switching costs because the NFTs and the user identity are kept on a blockchain. I think generally low switching costs, even though like we're investors in OpenSea, it's annoying, but it's the promise of the space is that users can switch. And so I think that's a good thing. I think the specific creator royalty thing is probably a separate issue. And yeah, I mean, definitely annoying. I'm definitely pro creator royalties, and I think it's an important part of what attracts people to the space. There's technical nuances with that. Like if you force creator royalties on the blockchain, you also limit, for example, the ability for a user to move NFTs from one wallet that person owns to another, and there's some nuances, but I think of that as more of a technical problem that will get solved. People are making proposals and that specific problem. But like I think generally, like it's a good thing for consumers that there is competition like that, right? That there is the ability to switch and choose, and you're not locked in. And that was in the book. I mentioned this. It was Moxie Marlinspike, who's a very smart security researcher, who was sort of arguing that blockchains are just going to do the same thing that's always happened, which is people will re-centralize around certain hubs. And empirically, we've seen the opposite, which does suggest, a positive thing, which is that this architecture does really kind of push choices out to the users.
Okay, we have just a couple minutes left with you, Chris. So what are some good faith critiques that you've had since the book has come out? I know there's quite a lot of misinformed or bad faith critiques, but what are some of the ones that have been more interesting to you?
Well, I think the best good faith critique is just sort of it hasn't happened yet. That,
Yeah.
It's a nice story, but until we see these products and all of this stuff play out, which is fair. I mean, it hasn't happened yet. What else? I mean, honestly, I think so far it's been sort of crypto people have all really liked it. And then as far as I can tell, the haters haven't read the book. Well, like there was one, I just saw it. It was like, RSS isn't actually dead. And I was just like, okay, like
I think I saw.
go to Google Trends, go walk down the street and ask somebody what social networks they use and how many of them use RSS. Like it's not even, I didn't even think of that as a possible objection. And by the way, I say in the book, like RSS of course still exists around podcasting, but it's just the point I was making was that in 2007, like if you walk down the street and ask somebody if they use social media, and most people wouldn't, but if they did, there was a greater than 50% chance they used an RSS reader. Like that was the dominant. And there was a moment at which that could have been the way people did this. And that didn't happen. And if you just look at the stats, it dropped dramatically. It still exists sort of as this thing behind the scenes for podcasting and other things and maybe in niche areas, but it's not 5 billion people like Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram. Someone else said I didn't have enough footnotes. I don't know, 36 pages of footnotes and 230-page books. I don't know. So I feel like some of the like I think there are good faith critiques, and I'm looking forward to them. I feel like so far it's been the critics haven't, for whatever, like maybe it's they just haven't thought it's important enough to actually read, I guess, or something. I don't know. But I don't know. What have you seen good faith critiques?
I saw one around. It was primarily around just the collective storytelling.
Oh,
piece.
Yeah. It's a really interesting question. Like, okay, so you have a world where you can push a button and create a video, like the OpenAI demo last week, right? And I assume that will be the world we live in. It's almost free to create content. Like, what happens, like in that world? Does all value and kind of scarcity go away around media, or does it shift to other areas? Like my experience in technology, it always shifts to other areas. And what I mean by that is maybe it's easy to create a video, a movie, but it's hard to get people to care about it. And and maybe getting people to care about it is about building communities who evangelize it and have a sense of ownership. And and that's kind of to your point, like you're mentioning, this is a chapter at the end of the book about collaborative storytelling. Like to me, that idea becomes even more interesting in an AI world because you're going to need new ways to organize people. And I don't know. I mean, presumably we're not just awash in tons of. I guess the dystopian thing is we're all just plugged into some personalized video feed and sitting there all day. But I
It's
think
like the Wall-E screens.
yeah, I mean, but I tend to think like humans fundamentally like humans, and that there will still be like it will mean something to you that other people like the story and that humans created some of the story. I feel very confident that's the case, and that we'll need new ways to kind of organize around media as an example. I don't know. So I think it's a very reasonable debate to have around that chapter of the book where I talk about collaborative storytelling, and maybe I'm wrong, but I would just love a world where we can have that discussion.
Yeah.
like as opposed, like I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying this is like a really fascinating area to discuss and explore, and not have just sort of name calling and like crypto's evil or something. Like that's my maybe naive fantasy, is that in 3 years we're all having discussions like that around like what's the right kind of network design in a world of AI, and what's the incentive systems we want for creative people, and like all these kinds of questions. And obviously there would be good faith critique. Like I'm speculating and about the future, and I obviously could be wrong, but like that, I just want to have that discussion and not
Totally
the discussion that we're having today.
Deana and I have another podcast called Two in Line where we dig into like a internet story, and I have to tell you, I have so much belief in your idea of collective storytelling, because the things that we find on the internet that people spend a lot of time doing, and the things that they do together in small communities online, is insane. And they spend so much time, and they care, and they do it with other people who care about the same things. And if there was an economic structure around that for those people, that would be incredible.
I'm laughing because what I know you're thinking about is, just for reference, Chris, last week we covered Duolingo fan fiction. People were writing fan fiction about the Duolingo bird. And then there's also Shrek fan fiction that's Sims, like in Sims world. And so people were marrying the Shrek Sims fan fiction with the Duolingo bird fan fiction. Anyway, so that's what Natasha's speaking to.
So put it on chain. I just want to end with one last question here. Many people who listen to this podcast are flag bearers for this industry. And what advice would you give them for choosing their heroes? What are some just best practices around projects, platforms, ideas that they love and advocate for? How do we not galvanize around another hero who is a bad actor?
Yeah, good question. I mean, this is where, in the book I talk about this computer versus casino idea, that there's sort of two cultures fighting over the kind of future of blockchains. And so I do think, hopefully by naming that and calling it out and like understanding that there's sort of different ethos around this, that's maybe step one. Yeah, that whole thing, it was interesting to watch because we weren't involved with any of those like FTX and things. And honestly, the main reason was not that I knew it was fraud and things. It was the computer and casino thing. It was like, this is just a different culture and different, like we're not interested in this stuff and it's offshore and I don't know. But I think a lot of this is a movement building though. So there's sort of the negative framing of like, how do we avoid the casino? And then I would think of it more in the positive framing of like, how do we build such a big, dominant, overwhelming computer movement that the other thing just seems like a sideshow? Right. Let me maybe add a note of positivism here, which is before I was saying like one great product will inspire people, but it's also like, there's always the new people entering their careers and they're always looking for something to do. And I think there's really just two things now. There's AI and blockchain. And, like our friend Dan Benet is a professor at Stanford. He teaches a blockchain course and there were 200 students last semester. It was the second most popular course after AI. AI is like 800 or something, so a lot more, but still like number 2. And that's been pretty consistent. I think there's a set of people, like to your point earlier about some of your listeners, who instinctively get that AI is establishment and crypto is anti-establishment. And it can be the wrong kind of anti-establishment, but if we can channel it into the right kind of anti-establishment, I do think that appeals to a set of people. And with the right nudges, the work you're doing, the work I'm doing, other people, if we can get those people, again, there's just every year there's 100,000 people entering the tech industry or something. And if we get some portion of them excited about this other vision, can we create a strong enough movement? And then it just takes care of itself, right? Like those are the people who build interesting things. They're the ones who end up becoming the people look up to and the heroes of the industry. That can happen pretty quickly if with the right things that happen and the right products. And I think we're coming out of the downturn, the negatives. I don't know, you would be closer to it than I am, but there was just a lot of bad stuff that happened a year and a half ago. And I feel like some of it's worked itself out.
I love ending on an optimistic note. Chris, thank you so much. This has been great, so fun. Really appreciate your time.
Really, really enjoyed it. Thank you.